and this session is called Innovations in Lunar Surface Infrastructure. Our moderator for this session is NASA's Deputy Associate Administrator for Exploration, Dr. Joel Kearns. Dr. Kearns is the Deputy Associate Administrator for Exploration in NASA's Science Mission Directorate. He leads the Exploration Science Strategy and Integration Office and the Lunar Discovery and Exploration Program, including the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Initiative. Dr. Kearns leads science planning associated with human exploration beyond low Earth orbit and integration with NASA's Exploration Systems Development, Space Technology, and Space Operations Mission Directorates. With that, Joel, take it away.
I've got a great panel of folks for you to hear from today. They're each going to make an opening statement and talk a little bit about what they think is important for you to hear about innovation in lunar surface infrastructure. I'm going to introduce them each. They'll have a bit of time to make a statement. Then we'll turn mostly to questions, to Q&A. And we have some questions we've been given. We understand there might be questions coming online, and we're going to encourage folks to ask questions here in the room. So I look at infrastructure from a science point of view. I'm all worried about science on the moon coming up over the next decades. So I'm more of a user of infrastructure, although I will tell you today at Mars, a lot of the infrastructure that's there is actually part of the science missions that are ongoing at Mars, you know, telecommunications, position navigation and timing, things like that. But infrastructure on the lunar surface and in cislunar space, as you heard at the last panel, is a little different. I'm showing behind me just an image of the area near the South Pole on the moon. And if you were to look at an image, say, from the Apollo landings or someplace that's closer to the equator of the moon, what you're probably struck by is that everybody lands there pretty well during the daytime, and everything's lit up. And it looks, you know, relatively flat except for mountains in the distance. But while you're sitting there working, it is pretty well everything's lit up. It's pretty easy to see things. And the Earth is relatively high in the sky. Remember, there's 14 days of lunar sunlight and 14 days, Earth days of darkness as the moon and the Earth interact over a month. So going to the South Pole, which is going to be the focus of our Artemis human landing missions, as well as many robotic scientific missions, is going to be a little different. The terrain's a little more highlands, it's a little rockier and blockier. But the thing that jumps out when you see images like what I'm showing here is that there are parts of it during the daytime which are lit up and bright, and there are parts of it that are dark. And it turns out that as you progress through the month, which is bright and which is dark during the daytime changes. So it's not all the same places that are always light. Now, there are some places that are always dark. They're at these permanently shadowed regions in the craters of the South Pole and the North Pole of the moon. And they are expected to be very, very cold. So the two things that brought a great attention to sending very complex robotic missions and also human missions to the South Pole are these really unusual lighting conditions where there at least could be some areas where it's light for most of the time, if not all the time, probably not all the time. But there's also these really dark areas that never get light where we might find volatiles like water, which can be very useful. Let me first introduce all the panelists you'll hear from today, and then we'll go back and we'll start with the first panelist and have him make a statement. We have Dan Hendrickson here, who's Vice President of Business Development for Astrobotic Technologies in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Dan is head of business development for all astrobotics different areas, such as landing on the moon, infrastructure on the moon, roving the moon, and many other things. And I'm sure he'll speak around. We have Seamus Toohey here, who's Senior Director of Robotics and Space Ops at MDA Space, and his charter is to expand MDA Space's robotics and space operations capabilities with NASA, U.S. commercial industry, and U.S. national security space systems in the future. We have Andrew Rothgaber, who is Director of Public Sector Business Development at ICON, the construction technology startup who's based in Austin, Texas. And in this role, Andrew works on off-world construction with NASA and advanced R&D projects with the Department of Defense and other government agencies. He also leads ICON's engagements with nonprofit and the Native American communities. And at the far end of the table, we have Chris Nelson, who's the Deputy Manager of Systems Engineering and Integration at the EVA and Human Surface Mobility Program Office at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. Chris manages the EHP technical and programmatic baseline, including development of integrated programmatic capabilities enabling the Artemis mission campaign. His primary focus is on lunar surface systems enabling crewed and uncrewed exploration. So first we'll turn to Dan. Dan?
Thank you, Joel, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much also to AAS for hosting us and including us in today's discussion. My name is Dan Hendrickson. I'm with Astrobotic. We're a space robotics company based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so just down the road here from the Glen area. And we've been at the lunar logistics game for going on 16 years now. So we've been working on and executing on a variety of missions and services around providing logistics and infrastructure, starting first with lunar delivery services. And so we do that with our robotic uncrewed landers. We have our first mission coming up here in Q4. We're on the Vulcan Centaur 1 with Peregrine Mission 1. You can see that vehicle here in the upper left corner. It's completely finished. It's in our clean room. We're just waiting for the green light from ULA to ship down to the Cape. So incredibly excited to be carrying 16 different customers on this first mission, representing 7 nations in some form, whether company, government, university, or nonprofit. And this will kick off our lunar activities. We'll be following that up with our second mission, which is Griffin Mission 1, which will be delivering the NASA Viper rover. It's a golf cart-sized vehicle that's going to be looking for water ice at the south pole of the moon at Nobile Crater. And those 2 missions will essentially be kind of kicking off our payload delivery services. And over the course of the last 16 years in which we've been in business, we've really come to appreciate the challenges and really the tyranny of the lunar night. That has really motivated us to look at ways to provide power and infrastructure to our payload customers to be able to ultimately to survive and hopefully one day thrive through the lunar night. And so with that in mind, we're taking a variety of the elements that we're developing in the company and bringing them together to develop a service called LunaGrid, which you can see on the right side of this image. LunaGrid is a commercial power service that we're looking to deploy to the south pole of the moon, providing power from vertical solar arrays to start, and over time looking to incorporate other sources and scale that service with things like fission surface power. So we'll start with the vertical solar arrays that we're developing under a NASA STMD contract. And coming out from that power source, we have our cube rovers, which are small rovers that carry cables and actually have reels that pull cable out from the power source and have wireless chargers to essentially act as mobile power plugs. So over time, we're looking to scale and to provide power to ultimately allow our customers to be able to survive lunar night and carry out a variety of different activities without having to have the power sources carried with them on each element that they go down to the surface with. So this is kind of the ultimate goal that we seek as a company, is to provide these commodity power services. And we really see that as the bedrock foundation for all future infrastructure on the surface, as well as then activities ultimately. And so this is kind of how we see the lunar landscape shaping up and the contribution that we want to make in the medium to long term. And with that, look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Let's go to Seamus.
You can go to the next one. So hi, I'm Seamus Toohey from MDA Space, the largest Canadian space company, and a deep contributor to really infrastructure element, the important one, the robotic space arms, that's been existing in low Earth orbit, and now extending that to cislunar space and hopefully to the surface. Do you want to give me the remote, or do you want to click on the next one?
Okay.
So long history on this chart of primarily in-space operations, robotic space operations, really, like I said, the key infrastructure element that would be required in the future. And for the cislunar space, we're also developing Canadarm3, a follow-on to Canadarm2, which is on station. This one will be on Gateway and will be the primary element for logistics handling at Gateway. We're also looking at surface mobility and relocatability systems, not only utilizing a robotic arm, but also significant sized rover, utility rovers, looking at how to utilize that system and how really to design the system to be a key infrastructure element for the moon and to build up the lunar base. There we go. So some of the things we've been looking at, in what this mobility platform would do is, first is crew safety and effectiveness. Safety's, paramount, but also the effectiveness to increase time on task of the astronauts. Now, this doesn't mean the vehicle is carrying the astronauts, but it's assisting the astronauts in doing what they do, not only during the mission, but also pre-mission and post-mission. And also looking at innovative science missions that could be utilizing this type of rover to build large aperture systems, the next generation of grand observatories that exist on the surface of the moon. So the challenge really is, and I think we're going to talk about that today, is to go from tools, which as engineers we love to talk about, different robotic systems, different end effectors, to an infrastructure where everything fits together and operates. There was mention at a previous panel of developing an urban plan. Well, I live in an urban situation where they did dig up the streets to lay new power systems. They did dig up the streets to lay new systems, and it's not unforeseen that will happen on the moon. But we need to be very efficient in how we do that. But the idea is, how do we move from real-time in situ systems to near real-time systems on the moon and eventually to Mars? How we go from human in the loop, which is the way a lot of things operate on station, to human on the loop systems, and eventually maybe autonomous systems. How we go from everything bought from Earth, which is what our logistics are right now, to we utilize things that are already present either naturally on the moon or resources that have been pre-positioned for us to utilize in a sustainable way. To go from missions, which are mission 1, 2, 3, to a sustainable presence that you look at doing new things with the resources that you have that exist at the surface and are being supplied to you. And I'll pass it on.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is this on? Yes. Andrew Rothgaber. I'm with Icon. Icon is a startup based in Austin, Texas. We're about 5.5 years old. We're mostly venture-backed, and the bulk of our business is in the residential market. So I'm probably the only home builder on the stage up here, but what we mainly do is build giant robots that 3D print homes, and we do that at scale. So the best example of that is a 100-home development that we're doing just north of Austin. We also work really closely with the Department of Defense. DoD is really interested in two things. One is terrestrial, well, both are terrestrial. One is building barracks and commercial structures here in the continental US. The other is developing more expeditionary construction systems. And on that front, NASA and DoD have a lot of shared heritage in the ACME and the ACES program. Really, both programs are about figuring out how we can use robotics to build things in extreme environments or expeditionary environments. And for NASA, that's the moon. And for DoD, that might be the South China Sea, or take your pick. So along the way, we came to NASA's attention through the 2018 Centennial Habitat Challenge. We were finalists there. And ever since then, the space team within ICON has been sort of a startup within a startup. And we're really focused on figuring out how we can use 100% ISRU to create surface technologies to build infrastructure on the moon. And that work really accelerated last fall when we got a phase 3 SBIR with NASA. Most of that work is taking place under a program called IMPACT, Moon to Mars, Planetary Autonomous Construction Technology, that's run out of Marshall. And again, the idea is to develop technologies that are 100% ISRU based. We thermally process regolith, and it results in very suitable elements for surface infrastructure. Could be landing pads, roads, berms, you name it. So our goal is really to be the proverbial crane provider in Miami. We think that the things we're working on will result in a lot of enabling technologies and enabling innovations. So I've talked about a lot of robots that we're developing, both terrestrially and for space. The robot that we build homes with would fit in this room, but it's huge. It's a gantry-style printer, and it extrudes cementitious material to build homes. Can't really fit one of those on a rocket. And so we're focused on developing robots that we can deploy with relatively low payload. So why am I showing, after talking about robots, why am I showing a picture of this moon-based plan? Well, the previous panel really talked about this, and I want to give a shout out to Ron's paper. It's excellent on the need for a master plan. ICON feels the same way. This is actually just one chart from a big study we did on the need to come up with a master plan for the lunar surface if we're going to have a sustained presence. And the reason I chose this image and this chart is just to underscore again that a lot of the innovations that we're going to be talking about here really depend on coming up with some sort of common vision of what the plan is. And the plan can be flexible, it can be modular, but I think we do need to see a plan and a sequence of when innovations are going to come online so that we can make investments and in some cases place bets on when technologies are going to be available to enable this kind of sustained presence. Thanks.
All right. Well, good morning. As Joel said, my name is Chris Nelson. I'm here representing NASA's EVA and Human Surface Mobility Program. I chose this image here for a number of reasons. One, for you guys to be aware of what that program is, and then I'll kind of talk a little bit briefly about the innovation and the infrastructure kind of context to that. What you see in this image is a handful of spacesuits, some rovers, both unpressurized and pressurized, and then you've got a set of other assets that are there, both in the background, and then a lander, maybe surface hab that you might see there. Our program in particular is focused on mobility, focused on the human as it relates to spacesuits being in the lunar environment, lunar surface environment, and then also on mobility in rovers, both unpressurized and pressurized, with crewed and uncrewed exploration kind of being the focus there. As kind of was talked about along the way here, and the kind of premise of this panel being innovations in infrastructure on the lunar surface, there's a number of things that you see in this where you'll kind of get a feel for the fact that none of these things can necessarily operate independent and by themselves for any extended periods of time. And so innovations in that infrastructure are really trying to drive at how do we leverage the strengths of any one of these assets in a way that compounds the capability of the agency and the commercial sector as we explore the moon and we look at ways that we can leverage the assets there for future missions. There's a number of things that were talked about in the last panel. Certainly appreciate Andrew hitting on the master plan and the needs for that. One of the things that is true about the lunar surface is it's a very difficult environment. Joel hit on that with lighting as an example. Certainly the regolith itself. There's a number of things in the last panel talking about communications. There's a whole host of things that as you look through the various assets that we might have on the lunar surface, ways that we can optimize those systems, right? Reduce wear and tear, whether it be building roads, so that we can better utilize the capability for the longer term in the areas that we want to truly explore. There's a whole aspect to bringing these systems together where talking about networking, right? How do we get information off of the lunar surface? If we go down the path that every one of these assets need to independently survive the lunar night, and they need to independently get their common data off of the lunar surface and back here to Earth, it starts to drive cost, starts to drive complexity, starts to drive questions on the longevity of those systems in those environments. And so really driving at infrastructure and systems that can help us offset some of that capability and really allow these assets to be good at what their specific asset expectations are and functional capabilities. Those are kind of the aspects that really drive into what we look at when we think about infrastructure. Talked yesterday, a whole panel on power. Surviving the lunar night is a really big deal. As you look at ways to augment a mobile system to survive the lunar night independently, there's a huge contrast and change or trade-off between mobility capability and the mass associated with trying to get those power systems independently placed on those assets. So looking at infrastructure in ways that we can then extend the capability, reduce the complexity of that system by enabling it to further focus on its characteristics and functional capabilities that are unique to that asset. And so as you look at this picture, we've got a whole set of different environments we want to end up in on the lunar surface for scientific exploration and other needs. That tends to push on flexibility, right? Being able to be in different places at different times. Joel talked about how the lunar light shifts across the surface, right? Some of the infrastructure that we're going to need is going to need to be there in order to enable the capability as we move forward, as we want to explore different areas. And yet at the same time, emplacing something ties you down, right? So how do you fight through that? And I think we're going to talk about that here this morning. So with that, Joel, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Could we go to the last chart in the package? Or could you? Thank you. So before we get to the questions, I wanted to put up here. Here's a composite image of daytime shots. At the bottom, you can see the South Pole, but if you look north of the South Pole, it doesn't look like the moon that you normally see up in the sky, and that's because this is a shot of the far side of the moon. So there's a lot of scientific interest in understanding what's called the volatile cycle, not a lot of practical interest in understanding, is there really ice water in the permanently shadowed regions in the South Pole of the moon? But there's a lot of other scientific questions that need to be answered at other locations besides the South Pole. So one of the questions also for about that is, how do we do that in places at other locations and other parts of the moon? What I'm showing in this composite shot, going from the bottom, which is the South Pole region, up a little bit northern is an area called South Pole Aitken Basin, which is one of the largest impact basins, the result of a cataclysmic impact billions of years ago, which we're trying to investigate to understand what was happening to Earth at that time, because the moon is a record of what happened in Earth that we don't see today because of all of history and all of erosion and weather over billions of years. So an interesting infrastructure question is, while we focus with humans at the South Pole, what do we do with humans or with robotics to even go visit these further away areas? Are we going to have robots working with humans? Are we going to have them transporting humans to different areas as opposed to landing in different areas? Are we going to do things robotically and bring things to the South Pole, which will be our focus of our base camp? So let me start up with questions for the panel. I'm going to start with a question we were given earlier and make it open. All of these will be open to all the panel members. What are some of the challenges likely to limit lunar surface exploration opportunities, and how might we overcome those with surface infrastructure? Let's start off. Whoever would like to take it.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think this is really kind of a complex question in that there's a whole host of things that were even talked about in the last panel. When we sit back and we think about the complexity of what we're trying to do, and we think about the many myriad of contributions coming from various aspects, when we think about different contract mechanisms, when we think about what each entity might have as their goal, if we don't unify that goal, right? If everything remains disparate, and if everything remains to a particular entity's goals only, right, we're going to end up in a situation where we don't have systems that can interconnect with one another. We don't have interoperability. And those limitations alone are going to start to create these niche markets, if you will, within the lunar surface that are going to limit the overall capability that plays out. Much to my comment on the chart I gave with regards to rovers and suits and the interconnectedness of those, no one asset or entity can do it all, right? And so the need to understand that master plan, the need to understand where is the bigger picture, where are we going, what is the vision of that, to understand the contributions of each entity into that process is going to be critical to make sure we've got the right integration points and understanding of what types of standards do we need to have in place in order to make sure that those systems can work together while also facilitating the growing market and the desire and the business cases that are there. I think one of the other things that I'll hit on, Joel, and then I'll pass it off to one of these gentlemen here, is it's not necessarily only about what we're doing, but how we're doing it, right? And so contract mechanisms, public-private partnerships, how do we leverage the skill sets and the capabilities in the various parts of the market to ensure we've got a cohesive system? There was a great question in the last panel about digital architecture, right? And even understanding how do we integrate all these with digital twins, and how do we integrate them with model-based systems engineering in a way that we can actually bring all these pieces together, understand the interactions of them so that we can leverage the unique capabilities of each for the greater good. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges that we have, and yet one of the greatest opportunities we have.
So what I would add to that is, I mean, I think the obvious thing is success. You know, we've just gone through a round, you know, over the last decade of awarding contracts, and you know the CLIPS awards, and the Human Lunar Return Architecture awards. You know, those have been out there and we're executing. And what was made apparent to me in the last panel was how many missions are on the books and are going to happen. You know, Dan talked about their missions. You know, so we have to be successful. So that's really important. But beyond that, a prioritization of need beyond the defined missions that are going to take place. So what infrastructure is missing is a definition of priority. You know, NASA has laid out a bunch of goals in their Moon to Mars architecture definition, but they'll tell you that they're all they're not in priority order. They're all important, and so in order for us in the industrial base to understand, you know, the order of needs that are need to be met and where we should put our money, you know, some type of priority outside of, you know, the Artemis human landing missions and the CLIPS missions needs to take place. You know, is it more important to have a landing pad? Is it more important to have roads? Is it more important to have a localized map of the area of these are regions we like, these are regions we don't like? You know, that enables us then to understand what we need to put in place to win.
I'll add, I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be cost. You know, on the one hand, it's an incredible victory that we've gone over the course of, I guess, really 3 to 4 years from having 0 U.S. robotic missions on the books to now, what are we, 7, 8 in the CLIPS program? That's a huge victory. But at the same time, each one of those is going to only last about 14 Earth days. So in terms of the science, almost like the time per kilobyte science that you get back, that's not a really great ratio ultimately. And that is a very high cost ultimately in that ratio. So if you can survive lunar night, you can actually change then that cost dynamic in a significant way, such that you could even have economic models where folks are buying time on a rover that maybe lasts months, if not indefinitely. And that, I think, is a real sea change then in terms of lunar surface exploration and science. So getting to that next level of surviving lunar night, I think, will be a major challenge that will be overcome such that we can change the overall time dynamic as well as value dynamic that we get out of doing surface exploration in the first place. And that's when things really change. They open up. You can afford to do things like prospecting campaigns that go months at a time, for example.
Yeah, and I would just state the obvious as well, which is funding. I think the Moon to Mars objectives are a great demand signal, and it's very encouraging to see how, since they came out last summer, NASA and the M2M team have really evolved based on feedback from industry and universities and other government agencies. So that's great. It's a great demand signal. I think something a little bit more prescriptive might help in the future. And then the second thing I'd mention is that I think the businesses, as represented up here, could do more to talk to one another about what those business models and use cases look like. I had a potential power provider approach us last week asking to sign an IDIQ for a power purchase agreement. Don't know what it should cost, really. If Icon builds a landing pad, what should we charge for that? Are there fees for idle times? How do we price any of that? I think there's still a lot of work to be done there.
Thank you. We will jump to see first now. Does anyone from the audience have any questions before we go to the next question that was submitted earlier? Okay, we'll go to the next question we already have. And go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Holler. I'm part of the photovoltaic and electrochemistry systems branch here at NASA Glenn Research Center, where we study solar cells, fuel cells, and batteries. Right now, we're doing some of our own research to see how we could survive the lunar night in some of our own technologies. So I just wanted to hear from you all, what is the biggest concern in your eyes surviving the lunar night, especially with regards to the lowest temperatures can get to 50 Kelvin, and then if you're in the equator, it can get up to 400 Kelvin, depending on the lunar day. So those are some pretty large temperature swings. So I just wanted to know your perspective. What is breaking? Is it the electronics? Is it the power system? What does not survive those 14 days, Earth days? Thank you.
So, first is material compatibility. Making sure that as you put your system together, that the different temperature ranges don't, we're not used to that, and so the extreme temperatures, do they cause your materials to expand at different rates? Or they will, but how much that is. Second is power storage. We'd like to keep things at least warm, warmish, to survive, and that power storage itself has to survive. And it has to operate, which is more important or tougher than the other systems that are just drawing that heat. They just have to survive. The power system actually has to operate through the night. Storage and the operation of the power system, I think, are primary, I would think.
Yeah, I would probably add, again, from the perspective of mobility systems, you have the temperature swings, right? Thermal management is going to be a huge thing. And figuring out how do you best package the components you need where to make sure that you do keep them warm, right? So that they can survive the lunar night. I think the other aspect of the lunar South Pole that makes it a little complicated is that those solar environments don't stay static. And so there's a very limited number, if you can kind of quantify, of areas that remain lit at all times, right? And so you can imagine that that will get very crowded very quickly if you're trying to permanently in place something. So energy generation is a really big question that we need to try and solve. The storage of that energy, the distribution of that energy, to enable the breadth of areas that we want to go and explore, I think are going to be key. But even systems that aren't necessarily the electronics, et cetera, right? You talk about material compatibility, wheels on a rover, right? Where do those temperature extremes and those swings start to cause material compatibility challenges associated? I think those are all going to be things that we need to try and work through, consider. They have different applications, different complexities associated with them, but that's probably the key areas.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the next question on our list, which was for the panel members. What elements of lunar surface infrastructure do you believe would bring the biggest benefits sooner, looking at the current public and private plans that you're aware of? For example, is it more important or more urgent to deploy power or communications or berms or landing pads or roads?
Yeah, I'm going to leverage Dan, and then I'll punt to Dan. I think power, right, is one of the most important in the context of getting assets to the lunar surface. Is complicated, it's complex, and it's costly. So anywhere where we can extend the capability of those systems on the lunar surface, we will get a large bang for the buck, if you will, in the context of the science and the data and the exploration capability that we get coming back from that. I think beyond that, comm system is probably the other critical component, right? There is, and Mike did a great job talking about this in the last panel, but there is a true challenge, right? Trying to figure out all the data and information we want to generate on the lunar surface, how do we get it back? And so thinking about what is that optimization point? How do we leverage cislunar infrastructure with lunar surface infrastructure? Where do we put computing power, right? Navigation was a key in there. There's a bunch of different solutions for navigation. GPS-like type of navigation certainly is something that SCAN is working on to try and get in place. But there are other systems, especially for early capabilities, right? You talk about LiDAR, you talk about IMUs and star trackers and things of that nature. That navigation capability, right, is going to drive a little bit of where we go and how we get there. But part of that requires significant computing power. So where is that ecosystem? Does that ecosystem stay in cislunar space as an effort to ensure the longevity of that asset, or do we try to put a network on the lunar surface, right? I mean, these are all very challenging questions, and I think early on, coming to a master plan that really gives us clarity on the way that we go is going to be critical.
Yeah, I'll heartily agree. And there's a reason that we're investing in power. We think it's sort of a baseline foundational capability, but it's a yes and. So what I mean by that is we don't look to just provide a power service or even just develop power sources, but we want those systems to be compatible for deploying other infrastructure elements. So imagine a vertical solar array placed at a key location. It's very high up. You're not just generating power to then distribute it, but also you have an opportunity to put a comm asset that can relay surface to surface and potentially reach a relay in orbit. And then similarly, you can utilize it for things like PNT. You could have a beacon, an RF-based beacon, for instance, at that tower. And if you scale them over time, and you even potentially put them at kilometer scale, which is our intent, you can start to really create coverage that enable a variety of services. So power provides the foundation, but then starts to enable other services, and then hopefully providing power to services like what ICON's doing, which are going to be, I think, no doubt, very power intensive.
So I'd give a little different answer. I put comm first, and not for a technical reason, but more keeping the program sold, keep the public interested. The amount of hits that a website gets when you're doing something on Mars or you're doing something on the moon is enormous. But keeping that going, so comm, being able to do, live imagery, real time, as near real time as you can, but large amounts of data coming back. People want to watch it on their phones. People want to watch it, what's going on. Keeping the public engaged in what you're doing requires, very high bandwidth communication, in addition to the science and everything. I mean, so I'm not disagreeing, but what we're about to do, what people in this room are about to do, and the industry is about to do, and NASA's about to do, very exciting. And so you need to tell people about it. You need people engaged. So I would put comm first.
I'll take a dissenting view and say landing pads.
Good.
Just for the fun of it. Landing pads are truly, I think, enabling infrastructure. And when I say they should come first, I don't mean a bunch of them. I mean one or two. They will protect all the assets that come immediately after, and those other assets should come immediately after. But landing pads are a beachhead in a very expeditionary environment, and I think they should be a requirement to some extent. But I totally agree with what you said, Seamus. The public aspect of it can't be ignored. And an autonomously constructed landing pad on the moon would, I think, be humanity's first instance of a construction project on another world. And the three pillars of Moon to Mars are science, inspiration, national posture. What better embodiment than that?
Especially if they're seeing it real time.
Fair enough.
So let me follow that question up because of some of the panel's comments. So I threw out examples of what those infrastructure elements would be when I posed the question. I said, well, it could be comm or power or position navigation and timing, or it could be landing pads or berms. But there are many other potential aspects of infrastructure that could be useful. Seamus, in your intro, you talked about a utility rover. And of course, Andrew spoke about using ISRU, and one of the illustration he used, was for structures and buildings, right? So let me ask, are there other aspects of infrastructure that we don't talk about because we naturally immediately jump to power or comm? Are there things that really, when you think about infrastructure in general, that government and industry and international partners should at least be thinking about now? Where are those elements in an overall strategy?
So maps. We talk about navigation. That's where you are. Maps tell you where other things are and where you want to go. And one thing that's I know when I came to this conference, the first thing I did was pulled up a map. I needed communication to do it, I needed navigation to do it, but the map was very critical. That's where I knew where the conference was. I knew where the roads were to get there, and I knew where I'm going to go to dinner the first night. So this is a very complex environment that we're going to be landing, operating, and building in. And a map that tells you these are the places we're interested in, these are the places we're not, these are the places that we've already laid down stuff for you to navigate to make it easy. This is where the landing pads are. I'll be plural. So I think the infrastructure element of maps, how those tie to a reference so that your navigation system's working, where the resources are, where lighting is. I think that would be a fundamental infrastructure element that could be utilized across everything we're doing.
I probably have two. One, I mentioned it earlier, but data management. Data, and really I would drive to knowledge management, right? In the context of the importance of not just having the data, but how do I share that data as we continue to gain that data and that knowledge so that we can leverage that across the myriad of areas. I think the other infrastructure, you talked about ISRU. I think, as I mentioned, the cost and complexity of landing things on the lunar surface. Mike, again, I'll pull on Mike's chart, his little mission chart, right? I mean, there haven't been a lot of successful soft landings on the lunar surface. And so, again, the complexity of that, the cost of that, the challenges associated with that are huge. And so when we sit down, we talk about logistics. We talk about power propulsion systems. We talk about oxygen if we're sending humans. We talk about, the way that we manage those systems. I think ISRU starts to play a really important role. Again, from a human surface mobility standpoint, I really much care about the consumables of the human. And so the cost and the complexity of landing logistics to survive there are going to be a limiting factor. And I think as we look at investments in ISRU and the development and the capability of producing oxygen and things on the surface, that it drastically changes the landscape of what we're looking at.
Okay, if there are no more comments on that question, let me turn to the room and see, does anyone have any questions they would like to bring up for the panel?
Yes. Could you talk a little bit more about the ISRU research being done, specifically looking into using the lunar regolith as building materials for some of these things like launch pads and roads? I believe for terrestrial applications, there's rammed earth, which is a sustainable building method that involves compacting mixtures of sand, gravel, and water to form structures that are comparable in strength to concrete. So I guess essentially my question is, are we looking at a rammed moon equivalent?
We aren't. And just to speak about ICON, we are looking at some of those concepts terrestrially and would love to talk to you more about those. They're pretty cool. But as I mentioned, we extrude a cementitious material for our terrestrial-based system. We're not bringing anything to space with us to produce the kinds of structures we're proposing to produce. It's 100% ISRU-based, and a lot of the work around advancing that technology is around simulants, figuring out how to create high-fidelity simulants, understanding the mechanical properties of them, and doing experiments leading up to a demonstration mission that will validate some of the down selections we've made around those simulants. So it's I'm learning a lot more about geology than I ever anticipated.
So we're looking at concepts built around, on Earth, if you have an emergency and you want to build a structure rapidly, use sandbags. That's one of the things you would use. So we're looking at, is there an equivalent on the moon where you use regolith that actually fill a container or fill a material that's either built from resources of the moon or brought from the Earth to then rapidly build structures on the moon.
Yeah, and I would just add actually that there is some healthy debate in the community, especially the LSIC community. There's excavation and construction. There are different views that excavation could count as construction by saying just preparing surfaces rather than actually building on them. So that's definitely an area of healthy debate.
Okay. Are there questions right now in the room? Please go ahead.
So yeah, that's a perfect segue into what I was going to ask. I was basically going to say is, do you think it's reasonable to consider some of these more pre-made geographic aspects of the moon, like caves, lava tubes, the side of a crater? Have you guys taken any consideration into some of these things? I mean, if 3 of your walls are already built, you have to build one wall. Is that great, or is it just not feasible? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, for habitats, we think that the way to go is to physically construct them. I mean, some of the obstacles you mentioned, micrometeorite protection from radiation, and so on, those are real threats. But I think at the South Pole in particular, the long-term vision for a habitat is to create a pressurized habitat made of using completely locally sourced resources. And some of that, I mean, we have a design for a habitat, pressurized habitats that involve printing sort of a torus-shaped structure that we then infill with regolith. So we'd need some excavation capabilities there. But lava tubes on the South Pole, I think, are hard.
I will just make a plug for caves as a site for exploration, at least. Certainly hear the challenges there, but some of the solar activity that can be documented through the layers of the regolith in those caves might be unique in the solar system. So they're absolutely worth visiting, and certainly robotic assets should go there and understand that better, with then hopefully understanding the physical understanding of could we use those caves at some point in the future.
Okay, we'll go back to the list of questions that we had before the panel. So from listening to earlier panels and some of the statements of this one might think that there's going to be recognized a need for a relatively high degree of integration and interoperability between infrastructure elements. And so the first question is, do you agree with that? And if so, why or why not? And the other is, given that, how would standards evolve, assuming that standards are needed for interoperability?
So I agree that interoperability standards are required. I will give you maybe one example. I'll use the example of spacesuits, right? Spacesuits, we have currently 2 providers on contract to build spacesuits. Those spacesuits have great innovations by those providers, and we want to be able to leverage those providers and the innovations from not only their partnerships within industry, but also academia as they continue to go down that path. However, we also have, as the agency, a contracting mechanism that we have multiple landers, right? And so, again, from mission to mission, as we run into challenges in one area, the ability to leverage the other, it's going to be really important that there's an interoperable standard by which both those landers and those suits can interconnect with one another, right, as an example. And so I think the challenge is identifying where are those interdependencies, and then how much do we go down a path of prescribing or leveraging industry partnerships to develop those standards. And I think that's going to be an important thing. We talk about logistics, moving logistics around. Robotics. You go down the list of all the different areas where, again, unless we are looking for everybody to bring all of their own stuff at all times, you're going to have interdependencies, and those interdependencies are going to have to rely on interoperability standards in order to execute effectively, right? So one, I would agree that they are necessary. I think identifying the areas where that necessity exists will come back to kind of maybe the vision and our thought process on how far we want to go with the vision of what we do there, and that's going to evolve, right, inherently. I think leveraging industry, academia, consortiums to develop those are going to be extremely valuable. I think there's a ton of partnerships that we have across academia and industry that there's a ton of expertise out there that maybe the government doesn't have. And so really leveraging and partnering together to develop those as opposed to trying to be government prescriptive is going to be important. I think over time, there's this ongoing, I was talking with Ron earlier, there's this ongoing debate about certification, right? And the beauty about industry is this kind of incessant like evolution of capability, right? We need to continue to evolve capability over time, and that means that those standards are going to have to evolve, right? The question comes in of determining at what point do you evolve that standard from a standard that's inclusive to now a standard that leaves something behind. COM is a great example. We've been talking about 4G versus 5G, 3GPP kind of capability out there. Well, we all carry devices that maybe can talk to both, but the tower out there may not be able to. And so an evolution in that standard that all of a sudden leaves an asset behind, you lose the capability of that asset, you lose the value of the redundancy you might have had in that. And so we've got to be very wise about the ways that we go down that path.
Okay, so I think some of the standards will come from the government, and I think they will be prescriptive. But what you don't want to do is have the government be overly prescriptive, but you actually want to have them evaluate and it be part of the evaluation criteria of where they put their investment. So what has been missing is in the platform proposals we've been doing, a lot of us have been doing, that hasn't really been a high evaluated element of the proposal. So we as responders actually don't value that because we only value things that will be evaluated on. So I agree, you don't want to prescribe every single nut and bolt pattern on the vehicles and the platforms and the way they interoperate. But you do want it to be a level of, you do want it to be evaluated so that if I come in with what I think is a better solution than is currently being used, it's evaluated better. It's not thrown out because it doesn't align, but it can't be something where it's not evaluated, because then I can propose anything, and the longer term goals of the customers of the customer base won't be met.
I'll add, I think the CLIPS program has done a really great job in this area in the sense that they will require services at a particular location. For instance, I want data back from this site. But they don't tell us exactly how we have to get the data back. So in some cases, that can mean direct to Earth, and then we have to make sure that, for example, the radios in our landers can be compatible with the ground station offerings that exist in the commercial market. So that sort of inherently starts to create standards. Then when we look at missions that need relays, we have to make sure that our radio is compatible with them and what they're offering commercially. So there's a little bit of, I think, organic market development that occurs to establish these standards. And I think so far we've started to see some success in that. It's not to say that that's the only process to be done for creating standards, because there's certainly others that have to be part of the dialogue long-term for other programs. But initially, I think this has actually worked out pretty well to start to establish some standards and some inroads.
Okay. So Jim, do we have about 5 minutes left? Let me ask then, okay, I want to make sure we hit any remaining questions for the audience. Go right ahead.
So I had a question about the business model. If you look at, we're all technologists, and we love the technology, and we love the idea of lunar exploration. But fundamentally, for a business to succeed, it needs a business model that closes. And I've yet to see a good one. Maybe you guys could each comment on a business model that closes, that goes beyond, let's say, either venture capital or a rich billionaire that's willing to invest, and one that's becomes independent of government subsidies. In other words, what does the commercial side if you were to look at this from a standpoint of like revenue equals pricing times volume, what's the pricing times volume equation that will make your companies profitable such that you don't consume capital? Sorry, I know it's a tough question.
Well, so I'll give a half answer. So, initially it is going to be a government market, and that, but it's how you approach that market, whether you approach it from a traditional response to an RFP, where 100% of the cost, is covered and you make a little money on it, but then the system is turned over to the government entity to operate, to one where it's commercial services for the government, and that's a big leap. The last panel talked about the public-private partnerships. That is one of those models where the government is guaranteeing an element of the market, enough for you to have a business plan, a business case that closes. And I've seen that happen on, commercial cargo, commercial crew, and maybe on LTVS. We'll see when those go in. But beyond that, it's very speculative, and so the business models we've been utilizing tend to operate on that assumption that you're going to make your return or close your business on a government services model, a commercial services model to the government or governments in the case of MDA, not so much a speculative commercial, pure commercial for commercial purposes. Did I try to answer your question a little bit? You always ask tough ones, John.
It's a start. Maybe the other panelists could also address it, but have you seen a business model, a business case that closes? Maybe the answer is no, which is okay. But I think we have to be realistic about this. And by the way, there's some great companies that have leveraged technology, but have had their real benefit is the business model. Uber's a classic example, which not a lot of technology, but great business model. Is there one out there that any of you think might work in this arena?
Sounds like a question our CFO planted. We think about it all the time, and I think I mentioned it earlier, but there's just not a lot out there that we can use to model. And I think the studies that we're probably all familiar with, not even really studies, but just papers that the banks put out or the venture capital community puts out, they're very broad. And so that's why I think businesses up here and in this room need to talk to one another a little bit more about how we're going to charge one another for these services and when we can expect them to come online. But it's all, there's so many interdependencies around when something needs to come online, and is that initial government user or customer going to pay for that first or this first? There's just a ton of interdependencies, which is why I think we have not seen a really robust business model for the lunar surface. Tons of stuff in LEO and so on, but it's lacking.
I'll add, it's been 50 years since the U.S. has had an asset on the lunar surface operating. And over the course of that 50 years, we've learned that the moon is a very different place than we understood it to be back in the Apollo era. So I think it's just critically important that we leverage the demand that we see right now for science and exploration, and it's not just the U.S. government, but it's other governments around the world, to get back to the surface, to understand how difficult is it to actually extract water ice from a permanently shadowed region. That's going to take a long time. It's going to take a considerable concerted effort over time. But there could be, I think, models where potentially we could utilize things like resources there. But it's not going to be a business case that closes in 3 years, for instance. But we need to get back to the surface, and we need to start exploring to understand how much content is there, how difficult is it to extract, what's the economics behind it that'll make it successful. So I think we're at sort of stage 0 right now, but I think there's opportunities there, and that's why you see so many companies that are interested in trying.
Thank you. Jim, one more question, and then we'll close. Okay.
Absolutely. Actually, just a point of reference back to the topic of standards. There is an organization that has been stood up by the private sector to advance standards. It's called CONFERS. And so I think it's important to recognize that while that's relatively nascent, there is an organization that exists for that purpose.
Yeah, I'll make one comment, Joel. So I appreciate that. I will say one of the areas that we have identified is a lot of standards that do exist are at this point inadequate for the lunar surface. There's a lot of standards that are out there that really address a number of things that might be applicable to LEO or even in space, but the amount of data and the capability of those standards for the lunar surface is lacking. And so that's an area I think we just need to continue to press in and lean in and grow. And so appreciate that.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed and learned something from this panel today. I certainly did. I want to thank the AAS for convening this panel session. I want to thank all the panelists for being here and taking their time to answer the questions, both from us and from you. Thank you, everyone.